Hi everybody, my name is Jeroen van den Bos, and in this video I will be talking about some of the design principles behind the Grand Canyon VR experience. Now, the Grand Canyon VR experience was my first design for a virtual reality title, and it was actually one of a handful few launch titles for the HTC Vive in 2016. Now, the landscape of virtual reality was totally different back then, so we had to work around some very specific limitations of the technology back then, and nobody really knew how to create virtual reality, so everybody was just trying to figure things out. So let's take a look at some of the design goals that we had from the very beginning before we started on this. Okay, first one was Uh, even though the HTC Vive had room scale from the beginning, we knew that a couple of months later the Oculus Rift would launch, and the Oculus Rift launched without room scale. That was designed for a seated experience. So we decided, let's do the same thing, and let's make sure that we design a title that can be played comfortably in a seated experience. Um, Back then, nobody really knew how to solve locomotion nausea in virtual reality. So we did a lot of experimenting, and we found that one very safe way of achieving locomotion in virtual reality that did not make people sick was to anchor them in some kind of vehicle. Second, that we found that if you give too much control to people, like you let them strafe left and right and run backwards, that is something that immediately triggered nausea in people, locomotion sickness. So we wanted to avoid that. So the idea was, let's create something that is more akin towards like a Disney dark ride. You know, these Disney rides like Pirates of the Caribbean, where you just sit in a little boat and you follow along a fixed path, but the environment that you're in is really beautiful, really immersive, and draws you into a certain atmosphere, and you have like cool stuff happening all around you. So we decided, why don't we do a kayak ride through the Grand Canyon, or through a Grand Canyon style environment. Um, and along so you would be on a fixed path, you would be anchored in the kayak, so that helps with the locomotion sickness if you have the user anchored to a point. We would not give them free locomotion, even though in the very beginning we actually came up with really nifty technique where you could use a stand-up paddleboard and actually just paddle around, uh, totally like free locomotion, and it was really cool. But it was only cool for people who have like almost no issues with locomotion sickness, which is a very small percentage of the people. So we abandoned that idea. And we got back to, let's just focus on making more of a Disney dark ride style ride, where you just nice and comfy, you're sitting in a kayak and you go along a fixed path, but we'll make sure that the ride is worthwhile. So comes to the second design goal, is let's focus on achieving presence. And the reason for that was because for me it was very clear that that's where the magic of virtual reality lies. So everybody else was trying to make zombie shooter games in virtual reality, and we said, what if we, instead of spending all the time and resources that we have to creating very compelling and sticky gameplay, what if we use these resources and apply them to what would happen if we create maximum presence, maximum immersions? Would we be able to create something that is just a ride on a fixed path, but would it be able to be still interesting enough for people to buy just because of the level of immersion? So that was the second design goal. The third design goal, I already talked about it a little bit in the beginning, was to solve the big problem that everybody was having back in those days, was solve the locomotion sickness. So the way we solved that is, one, fixed path, two, anchor the user inside a vehicle, which is the kayak, here, and do not make sudden crazy movements. So it has to be, for example, if you turn a corner, it has to be a gradual corner and don't make like a 90-degree turn or anything. And then the last goal that we had was solve performance bottlenecks. Now, this is a lot easier now, but back in the days, you know, the Unreal Engine and Unity, they were not really optimized for virtual reality yet. So it was much harder to achieve performance that was adequate, because virtual reality, not only do you need to hit 90 frames per second, you also back in those days you also had to do it twice, one for each eye. So it was pretty hard to do. So that's why most of these early games, if you look back, they all have very cartoony graphics and almost no shadowing, is because they just couldn't get it done. So we spent a lot of time, how can we make something that still looks real and still achieve 90 frames per second on like a, you know, average gaming hardware. Right, so let's highlight some of the best tricks that we discovered that really boosted immersion in this title. So one was actually really surprising. So what we did is, okay, we know the user is sitting down because, you know, this is designed to be a seated experience. So we know the position of the head because the user is wearing a headset, and we know the position of the headset. So what we could do is we can calculate the angle between the where you're seated and the angle and your head. And if there is a you know, if it's at an angle that if you would be sitting in a kayak and you would lean over to the left, the kayak would tilt to the left with you. So we said, let's mimic that behavior in our virtual kayak. So what happens is, if you tilt your body left or right, the kayak will tilt with you. And that little connection, that's almost like a feedback loop that connects the position of your physical body to the virtual kayak, made a massive difference. It really tremendously boosted the level of immersion in our title. Another thing is audio. It was amazing how important audio is for increasing the immersion in your title. So in our very first version, we did what we always do in video games, is we just had a background track, you know, some background sound of some creek somewhere, of a river, with all the ambient noises in one WAV file, right? And it sounded okay, but it wasn't. It was only until we said, let's try to create this differently, that we realized how much more immersive it is. And so what we did is, instead of having one audio track that contains a whole bunch of sounds in one WAV file, like the sound of the water, the sound of frogs, the sound of birds in the distance, all of these things, we decided to break it down to in each core component, and then layer those up again in 3D positioned inside the scene, right? So what we did is we put blueprints in all the trees that would at runtime select one of a potential species of bird, and then that bird would just go through random bird calls, but it would be 3D positioned in exactly in that tree. We would do the same for insects. We would do the same for like water sounds. So we would actually construct the ambient soundscape, but we would construct it by layering individual pieces in the 3D world. We had an amazing sound designer who did an incredible job on this. His name is Mitchell Lucas. Look him up on YouTube. He has some really awesome work. So together with him, we really created a fantastic ambient audio system that just took the immersion of this title up another level. Now, another thing we did is, in the beginning, you couldn't control a kayak at all. You would just sit there, and you would just go at a set speed, and which was good because it didn't make people sick. But once we added a manual control that people could actually just use their virtual hands and control the speed of the kayak. Now, they still couldn't control where the kayak was going. The kayak was on a set path, you know, remember, to eliminate the motion sickness. But just the fact that they could control it, that they had an influence over the world. For example, if they would want to take a break, they could just put the throttle to 0, and the kayak would slowly slide until and comes to a gradual stop. that would make all the difference, because it made the connection between you and the virtual world more real. And then the last thing that was really an immersion boost was when we added interactive elements to it. One of them was we had fish swimming around. So we said, why don't we put something in the boat, like a little can of fish food, and why don't we create a fish with, instead of just a scripted animal, like scripted behavior, just animation in a loop, like we had in the very first versions. Why don't we make some crude AI that where fish would, if they see food being dropped in the water, they would try to get it and eat it. And so that little interaction that you would have, for example, you would be in your kayak, you would see a school of fish, you would stop your kayak, and you would then be throwing fish on the water, and the food in the water, and the fish would eat it. That again made another connection between your virtual body and the virtual world, and it really upped the immersion. And then another thing we added was the addition of hotspots. So hotspots was, we wanted to have certain spots along the path where you could actually exit the kayak. And what we would do there in these spots, we would teleport you to like a seated position. Imagine like a little campsite with a little camp chair next to a fire. So that little zone we would call a hotspot, and we would increase the level of detail in this zone. We would cram as much detail as we can in that little zone. So if people come across that, what they would have to do then is they would just see a little copper bell. So there was no explanation given whatsoever. But we knew if we put a copper bell right next to the path and you come across it in your kayak, people are going to be curious enough to smack that bell and see what happens if you ring the bell. So what would happen if they ring the bell? They would get teleported out of their kayak, and they would suddenly find themselves sitting in the middle of that beautiful hotspot. And so we designed these hotspots along the path to have like the most epic views, and with lots of detail, and like really increase the level of immersion there. And so it's a little part of freedom we gave to the users, that there's at certain points they could, if they wanted to, they could exit the kayak and just soak in the atmosphere. So there you have it. That was a little insight in some of the design philosophy behind my first design of my first virtual reality title, the Grand Canyon VR Experience.